Hi everyone, welcome to the first session in our Human Rights Week. Every year, beginning in this week of December, we celebrate, we mark, as it were, Human Rights Week, and we're doing that with a session on an essential human rights challenge, which has been around for centuries and decades, but has particularly re-emerged, I think, and forced its way into everyone's public consciousness in recent years, in recent months. So my name is Andrew Fagan. I'm director of the Human Rights Centre. I am joined at the moment by Kojo Koram, who I'll introduce to you more formally. Kojo is an informal guy, but I'll introduce you a bit more formally. We were also hoping to be joined by Sophie Kabangu, who perhaps is out there somewhere, to basically conduct a conversation. So rather than many of the kind of seminars and events that we hold throughout the year, which tend to have a more formal academic presentation dimension to them, we're really going to have more of a conversation. Hopefully Sophie will be able to join us. If not, of course, we will push ahead with a conversation with Kojo. So let me introduce Kojo without further ado to you. Dr. Kojo Koram is a lecturer in law at the Birkbeck School of Law at the University of London. He joined Birkbeck in September 2018. Prior to taking up this role, he was lecturer at the School of Law at the University of Essex between 2016 and 2018. Kojo was a great loss to us. I'm sure you're happy where you are now, Kojo. Prior to academia, Kojo worked in social welfare law, as well as youth work and teaching. He was called to the Bar of England and Wales in 2011, and then received his PhD in 2017. In 2018, the Association for the Study of Law, Culture and the Humanities awarded his PhD the Julien Mezey Dissertation Award for the dissertation that most promises to enrich and advance interdisciplinary scholarship at the intersection of law, culture and the humanities. Alongside his academic work, Kojo has also written for publications as varied as The Guardian, The Washington Post, The Nation, Dissent, The New Statesman, and Critical Legal Thinking. Kojo, welcome back to Essex. Sophie, you're joining us.
Hey, hello.
Hey, Sophie, let me introduce you as well as I'm doing the formal introductions. Sophie grew up in London and moved to Harwich when she was 16. She is one of ours. She's a sociology and human rights undergraduate student at the University of Essex. For the past year, Sophie has been part of Amnesty UK's Rise Up programme, bringing together young human rights defenders from across the country. So let me formally welcome Sophie and Kojo to this discussion. Sophie, I was just saying that we're going to have a relatively informal conversation. Yeah. What we will do for the benefit of at the moment, 38 participants, what we're going to do is to have the conversation around a series of themes and questions that we had previously discussed. And then towards the end, perhaps the last 15, 20 minutes of this hour session, we'll open up the floor really to questions from the audience. You can, of course, set your questions, raise your questions through the Q&A, or indeed, if you prefer, through chat, but the Q&A is a more useful for our purposes mechanism. Okay, so by way of just a few introductory comments from me, the struggle against racism has played a fundamental role in the Human Rights Project. And I mean the Human Rights Project in a broad historical sense, dating back, of course, to the abolition of the Atlantic slave trade, although, as we know, not the abolition of slavery at the beginning of the 19th century. More recently, of course, the overthrow of apartheid in the Republic of South Africa, marked, of course, by the civil rights achievements in law, at least, in the United States and many other countries throughout the liberal, capitalist, democratic world. The election of Barack Obama was greeted by some in 2008, was greeted by some as marking somehow the United States movement into a post-racial society. Believe it or not, these were views that were held quite widely at the time. This year has been challenging, to put it mildly, for all of us. It has clearly added exponentially to the workload that the human rights community has to undertake over the years and decades ahead. COVID has shone a light on areas of discrimination, socioeconomic inequality, marginalization across our societies. It's the poor, and it's particularly many ethnic minorities who have been most affected disproportionately by COVID. And then, of course, in May 2020, earlier this year, we had the brutal killing of George Floyd, which raised an awareness once again. Many, I'm sure, didn't need reminding of this, but many others did, that systemic racism remains a fundamental feature of our world. So I really want to start the conversation by asking both Kojo and Sophie, what do you take the lessons of Black Lives Matter to be for the human rights movement? It's a broad question. Please address it as generally or as specifically as you prefer. Kojo, did you want to kick us off?
Sure, I will do. And first of all, thank you so much for that introduction, Andrew. Thank you to everybody at Essex Human Rights Centre. It's really wonderful to be back and to continue the conversation that I'd started with Andrew and with many other members of this community when I was a lecturer here at Essex Law School myself. And it's great to be in conversation with yourself, Sophie, as well. So really looking forward to being able to share thoughts over the next coming period of time. In response to the question that you initially posed, what are some of the lessons that the Black Lives Matter movement might be able to provide to the human rights community? I think that one of the first most immediate ones is an indication of the groundswell of public excitement that actually greeted the protests and the actual refusal of systemic racism following the horrific murder of George Floyd in the United States of America, not just in the United States or across all the cities around there, but all over the world, in Auckland, in Amsterdam, and of course in the United Kingdom itself. And I think it's we're starting to, around 6 months afterwards, starting to see a little bit of historical revisionism in the characterization of the Black Lives Matter protests that we saw in the middle of the summer months. And with the booing of the players taking the knee at the Premier League football game over the weekend, we're already starting to see a lot of response within the kind of mainstream media and within the political class, characterizing the Black Lives Matter protests as something that is only of interest to the kind of metropolitan liberals, the same kind of demonization of the human rights have faced over the previous decades, and the idea that the people who are booing the players for taking the knee are people who represent traditional deindustrialized areas that have been left behind and that feel offended and intimidated by a kind of militant, angry Black Lives Matter movement. Now, the problem with that is that if we actually remember the summer months, there weren't just Black Lives Matter protests in London and Birmingham and Manchester, but there were Black Lives Matter protests in Sherborne and the Shetland Islands and in incredibly, monocultural parts of rural England that through a kind of organic generation of rage about what had happened to George Floyd, but about the wider systemic racial issues that continue to plague our society despite legal equality, took people out of their homes in the middle of a global pandemic to try and vocalize that anger and vocalize that response. And that is a groundswell of protest against a human rights issue that we've not seen in this country ever. I think that we forget that the protests, Black Lives Matter protests in the summer that's just passed, were the largest anti-racist protests in British history. So when we think about the Bristol bus boycott, we think about the original Notting Hill Carnival, and all these other moments that are now memorialized and sanctified, they did not represent as expansive and as sustained an anti-racist protest as what we saw over this summer period. And I think that that is something, despite a lot of the issues and missteps or conflicts that might have emerged within the Black Lives Matter movement over the subsequent months, that is a moment of excitement. And that is a moment I think that anybody engaged with human rights as broadly framed should feel excited and proud about. And so that's what I'd say is probably one of the first lessons that we could draw upon from it.
Kojo, thank you so much for such a detailed response. Thank you. Sophie, I know, recall very clearly your passion and your excitement at organizing Black Lives Matter movements and protests in Colchester, in our local community. How have you, as a human rights student, and interestingly, as a non-law human rights student, Kojo has a very distinct critical legal studies dimension to his legal scholarship. But as a non-law student, how do you see what do you see the key lessons and implications of Black Lives Matter for the human rights community of which you're part?
Yeah, I feel like for a very long time, people would view Black Lives Matter separate from human rights and would have put the two together. And that's not the case at all. And I feel like when you look at the protests that happened in dominantly white areas, I feel like it did take a lot for me and loads of other activists to sort of stand up and say, this is an issue here. No one's said it, but I want to be the one to say it. And it kind of, people kind of listen. People really want to listen. I don't know if it was because we're going through a pandemic, but people wanted to know. And they're like, oh, like their world was like kind of shaken. They're like, oh, I didn't know this was something that happens in Colchester or something that happens in like a small town up north. And people learn and they're sort of like, how comes I've been sort of deprived of this any other time? Why has it taken a global pandemic for me to realize that racism does happen in the UK? And it might not be as explicit as it happens in America or other places, but it definitely does happen.
Thank you, Sophie. One of the things that's so interesting, and certainly your contribution to Black Lives Matter locally, it underlines the extent to which this is a movement, a social movement, that as such seeks to, or rather draws much of its strength from the limitations of law, right? Yeah. I mean, legal rights have been established, formally speaking. Recognition before the law, formally speaking, either has a colorblind, so-called colorblind dimension within English law, for example, or does extend to include particular consideration for racial and ethnic minorities. So the law has been established. One could, of course, can point to numerous instances where the law has not been implemented, or where local authorities, police authorities or the like, are reluctant to implement the law or to pursue prosecutions that may be required in certain instances. But as a social movement of which you're a key contributor, what does that say for your understanding of human rights, for the sort of predominant legalized vehicle or legal vehicle for which human rights has often been born?
I feel like during the whole movement during the summer, I saw, obviously as a sociology student, I am really aware of everything that goes on. And me and my friend, who also studies sociology, we say we always view things differently. We can't even like watch TV without overthinking everything. And we're like, oh my God, I can't believe I just did that. And sort of, so when like social justice issues happen, we have a different view on it. And then we sort of look at how people respond to that as well, not from a law perspective, but more from a sociological perspective. And you look at what Durkheim and Weaver are saying, like, and somehow it is relevant, even though it was years and years ago, it's still relevant today.
Sophie. Kojo, Black Lives Matter as a social movement, what are its strengths and some of its potential pitfalls for the Human Rights Project, given the centrality of law still within the Human Rights Project as a key instrument, a key tool for social justice?
Absolutely. I think, this relationship between the kind of legalistic, doctrinal elements of human rights and the more kind of nebulous and potentially more radical orientation of kind of social movements, such as ones focused on race like Black Lives Matter, has a very long historical chronology. And it's always been a kind of an underside to human rights, even if we go all the way back to when the kind of trajectory of human rights really emerges in the Western tradition. We start thinking about the American Revolution. We start thinking about the Declaration of the Rights of Man in France. We can already see in both of those instantiations the way the race sits underneath that and is in this kind of productive tension that is that in the American example, well, in both examples, to be honest, resulted in quite violent confrontation. There's when we talk about the kind of history of human rights as it emerges as a philosophical concept and then becomes a legal norm, we often do talk about the history of the American Revolution and the French Revolution, but we don't often talk so much about the Haitian Revolution, which is the underside of that French Revolution and that establishment of the, Universal Declaration of the Rights of Man is heard by the most profitable slave colony in the world at the time, Saint Domingo. And, C.L.R. James's masterful history of the Haitian Revolution, Black Jacobins, really kind of emphasizes that point, that this is, the only successful slave revolution that's happened in human history was a result of slaves hearing the discussion of declarations of rights of man, of the intrinsic equality of all, men, and the gendered element of that as well is something we might want to explore. But, hearing that and going, well, that must apply to me. That must make sense to me. There's that apocryphal potential scene that people talk about of, the French soldiers arriving in what was then San Domingo to put down the slave rebels, singing the song La Marseillaise, and then hearing the slaves singing the same song back to them, saying, "You're talking about, universal rights of all humans. Well, then we're going to echo that back to you." And it brings into, I think, tension that question of the law focusing on the question of rights. Are the rights established? Are the rights concretized in law? Are they able to be enforced by whatever legal institution has the authority within that jurisdiction? But I think what the history of race and of social movements that have been focused on race, all the way from the Haitian Revolution to the Civil Rights Movement, to the anti-apartheid movement, to Black Lives Matter, what they focus on is on the question of the human. How do you define who qualifies as human? And race has been a historical attempt to categorize particular people outside of that label of humanity, to relegate them from that category of humanity. And I think that that's the real contribution that it has to human rights, is to not just say, what are the rights and have those rights been established, but to really ask yourself who is being qualified and who's being disqualified from that category of humanity. And I think that's what really people are calling for. When you look at what happened to George Floyd, when you watch that 8-minute video, you can only be left with the conclusion that this person is not being treated in any way like a human being we would expect to be treated. And if the law is not going to provide him justice, and I think that's the other thing that people forget as well, is that outside of the protests, Derek Chauvin and those other Minneapolis police officers were not going to face justice. That was going to be brushed under the carpet. It was already not going to be investigated, and it was going to end up like so many other cases that we've seen with Tamir Rice, with Eric Garner. Even if it got to court, there would of course be the acquittal of the officers. And so in that situation, you're saying someone's not being treated like a human, the law's not being given them justice. It's not a question of simply establishing their rights. It's a question of expanding your understanding of who is a human just like you. And I think that's what the movement was really calling for.
Can I just follow up quickly on that, Kojo? Do you see this as a consequence of inherent limitations of law, or as a consequence of a racist institutional set of racist institutional structures that in a sense kind of prevent the realization of human rights ideals and values? So is it intrinsic or is it extrinsic?
I would say that I wouldn't say that it's intrinsic within the law. I think that, we have to focus on the institutions that actually produce these inequalities. So we have to talk about the police and how that institution functions. We have to talk about the, prisons and how those institutions functions. We have to think about borders, how those institutions function. But I do think that we can't assume that the law is a neutral category, that the law is simply a negative in which these institutions feed within. The specific research area that was really my main project, both when I was at Essex and now, the area of international drug law, which has an incredible kind of parallel with actual international human rights law in terms of when it's passed through the United Nations, even some of the main actors that are involved in the crafting of it within the American kind of humanitarian tradition, your James Brown Scotts, your Ilya Roots, those doyens of American liberal internationalism are the same people who oversee the implementation of international drugs law. That has been used, that legal instrument has been used as a weapon in order to maintain structural racism. It allows police officers on the street to be able to stop and search, you know, people who are disproportionately Black, as we know that they do from their records. And we know that suspicion of drugs is the #1 ground that is given for stop and search, far and above the knife crime stories that we might read in the press. And so law can be used as an instrument to maintain the structural racism by those institutions. But I think what the protests in the summer were really talking about was the institutions. What are these institutions? You know, how do they come to be? Do they still operate as they should do? Do they treat the communities in the way that they should do? And is there ways that we can reform them? Reforming the, you know, or as we saw with huge amounts of the people calling for, restructure society to not need those institutions, at least in the way that we've come to know them.
Thank you, Kojo. Thank you very much. Sophie, coming back to you. This is a very sort of general, blunt question, I suppose, but it may lead to a more specific sort of angle. But what's it like to be a young Black female activist living and operating in a part of the country which, rightly or wrongly, has a reputation for forms of everyday racism that do not go, all too often go unaddressed and unacknowledged and unchallenged? What's it like to be you at the moment, living and struggling, fighting in that part of England?
Trying to think of word to use. It's very crazy, I would say. I feel like for a very long time, I just sort of like just didn't do much. I just sort of sat back and witnessed things happen and didn't really use my voice. But I didn't really know I did have a voice. I didn't really know that people would want to listen to me. And then the minute I did start speaking and people did want to listen to me, I was like, oh my gosh, wait, there's people that want to learn and people that actually care. And I sort of like, I was like I'm just like any other gal, any other 21-year-old student. But I feel like because I'm Black, it's more like, oh, but you're more of like an activist. You're not just like anyone else, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Sorry, how's your knowledge of human rights affected your motivation to act and the way that you've acted? Has your education played an important role in what you do?
Oh my God, it's played such a huge role, like massively. And I feel like during like first year and second year, I'd sit through my lectures and I'd learn and I'd hear what my lectures had done, all the work they had done. And I was like, that's amazing. I can't wait to eventually graduate one day and do all of this, and then only to do it during a global pandemic. And I was literally like, wow. But also I definitely would have never have done this if it wasn't for my degree, if it wasn't for everything I'd learned in sociology and everything I'd learned in human rights. And I feel like as well, we're always taught about issues elsewhere in the world. So it's always something that's wrong somewhere else. It's not here. Everything's fine here, but there's something wrong in America, there's something wrong in East Africa. And then it's just sort of like, wait a minute, no, what about where I'm living right now? There's human rights issues right here.
There was a comment in chat just now, interestingly enough, if this happens in Colchester, then the HRC has failed in its duty as a centre that champions the right of all humans. So acknowledging that particular claim. But the question to both of you really, what can academia do? What can academics do more effectively to confront systemic racism, which has emerged so obviously for all of us in these past months? Sophie, did you want to pick up on that one, and then I'll set the same question for Kojo.
Yeah. To be honest, like I'm still learning, and I've learned that it's not as easy as it seems, and it's not something that's going to happen overnight. It's not just that the system has to change, it has to be dismantled and a new one has to be created. And that's the only way change is going to come about. Yeah.
Are we not part of the problem, though? So being slightly critical of myself here, but are we not part of the problem? Universities are instruments that convey a certain form of privilege, economic privilege, cultural privilege, social privilege in all sorts of ways. Those with a university education are considered by some, and certainly consider themselves in some cases, to be somehow superior to others. We know that access to higher education, particularly amongst BAME or people of colour communities in the UK, is so much disproportionately less than it is, more difficult than it is for others. Are we not part of the problem?
Yeah, you are.
What can we do?
It's hard to just I feel like there's small steps to, like, for instance, decolonizing the curriculum would be one step. Having more Black lecturers would be another step. But obviously there's reasons why there isn't Black lecturers. So it's, I just feel like it's just really complicated to have like the perfect solution. Like, if it can happen overnight, it just won't. I feel like the way people think has to change as well. Yeah.
Thank you. It's a tough question. I mean, to put it mildly, it's a tough question. Kojo, a tough question. I mean, I know you've been very active in seeking to reach out to wider audiences than simply just academic seminars and the like. You've written for a number of national newspapers and publications. I'm sure that your voice has had an influence well beyond the academy. Are you happy with that? Is there more that we could be doing as a set of institutions, and then people working within institutions as educators?
I think I'd really, kind of defer to, what Sophie was saying, as the students, as the people, we're supposed to be assisting. I think one of the big things we can do is to listen to students, particularly young Black students, young Black students who are, women, who are queer, who are bringing all these different identities. I think that, this will hopefully be a great learning process, because one of the great big myths that we have of ourselves, I think, within the university particularly, is that whilst a lot of these structural inequalities and limitations occur at the school level, university is this free space of, open inquiry and, liberal dialogue where, these kind of inequalities don't manifest. That's the kind of image of the university, and in some ways it works, but then when you actually drill down and look at the details, we realize that there's not only is there a massive divergence in the quality of degrees the students are getting from different backgrounds, but what actually happening in universities is we're having students come into the institution, Black students in the majority coming into the institution with a particular grade and leaving at a lower level than their white counterparts. So we're actually introducing new inequalities. And a lot of universities trying to get the race equality charter, and this is really one of the main insights of that we're introducing new inequalities within the university. And I think that could have a lot to do with not only the shape of the curriculum, but the wider culture around universities as well, and the way in which we haven't engaged with questions such as the way that the bordering works within the university, the way that access to research funding and those kind of opportunities that happen kind of behind the scenes, and all of a sudden a leading undergraduate student becomes a research assistant. All of those little opportunities, I think we need to think about how structural racism functions within those moments, and I think also to be prepared to face it as a wider community, not just to make it an issue of the Black students and the Black Students Union and this is their issue, because then it can easily be presented, and this is what's happening with the kind of wider culture war on universities at the moment, as you know, all of these kind of snowflake students are trying to destroy the history of kind of free liberal inquiry and, you know, reorientate it towards their own interest. And all of a sudden, you know, you're not allowed to read Shakespeare in an English department now. You know, everyone has to read Toni Morrison, or, you know, you're not allowed to, you know, like, and you do, you know, in the national newspapers, you read stories that are this hyperbolic. And I think, you know, as an entire university community, I think it'd be really helpful to make it clear that there's not an antagonism, that it is not only helping Black students to introduce Toni Morrison on an English literature degree, but that is something that is of interest to everyone who's studying that degree. It is not only of interest to the Black students to talk about the way the structural racism might manifest in property laws or in criminal laws. That is something that is going to be of interest to all of those students studying that. And I think that would be something that will be really helpful in the wider conversation.
Thank you, Kojo. Before we move to accept some, engage with some questions from the audience, I just wanted to explore one additional area, really, which I suppose is the kind of issue of identity politics. Some of the lessons that were learned, that some took at least from the limitations or the failures of Martin Luther King's approach to civil rights in the US in the 60s, was a so-called colorblind approach simply does not work. It fails to address the specific experiences and injustices that people of color in the US and elsewhere experience and suffer from. And we notice, of course, both within academic scholarship, but within activism more broadly, a so-called form of identity politics has emerged in the last 40 years or so, precisely to address those kinds of shortcomings across a whole range of different communities of people. Do you see Black Lives Matter? This is a question to both you and to Sophie. Do you see Black Lives Matter in that context? Do you see it as a form of identity politicking? And if so, does that raise, again, are there kind of gains and potential losses from that? Kojo, did you want to carry on with?
Sure, absolutely. And I really would like to hear from Sophie on this point as well. But there's a couple of, I mean, first of all, the first thing I want to just highlight is the kind of rememorialization of Martin Luther King that now happens subsequently. And it's also done within the language of human rights, the idea that, you know, the only time you will hear particular figures defend the kind of universal liberal language of human rights is when they're placed in an opposition with, you know, the kind of identity politics as Black Lives Matter has been framed. And, you know, Martin Luther King all of a sudden becomes someone who was about unifying, you know, he was about nonviolence, he wasn't about confrontation, he wasn't about peace. And they talk about him like he wasn't someone who was shot in the head. He was an incredibly unpopular individual at that time. And all these people who wish to venerate him now would have all been lining up, castigating him, you know, castigating his movement and talking about it in incredibly similar terms. They talk about the Black Lives Matter movement today. So we shouldn't pretend that there's this juxtaposition between a more kind of liberal universalizing manifestation of racial organizing and a more kind of confrontational identity politics based of it, because the story of Martin Luther King actually shows the opposite of that, that on particular claims, regardless of how you organize, that is going to be seen as violent, because it's going to see as violating the norms of the society in which you orientate. And the etymological roots of those words are obviously clear. But the thing that I want to talk about when we talk about is Black Lives Matter movement purely identity politics, again, you know, the kind of iconic scene of the Black Lives Matter protests that we saw over the summer was the pulling down of the Edward Colston statue in Bristol. That's the kind of scene that, you know, I could imagine in 10, 15 years time might become like posters on students' walls or whatever. And the thing that is visibly clear to anyone who looks at that is that this is not just Black people who are involved in this protest. In fact, it's not even predominantly Black people who are involved in that protest. So it's not, and this is the you know, the fallacy that we often see within a lot of the rhetoric of the kind, you know, recently we saw the equalities minister of the government talk about how, well, we need to ban discussions of Black Lives Matters in school because this is something that makes, you know, young white students feel, you know, attacked and isolated and you know, affronted. What the kind of Colston statue moment showed, and what all these protests around the country showed, is that with at least, maybe I'm a little bit old. I'd be interested to find out whether Sophie would agree with me, because maybe I'm having rose-tinted glasses of the younger people. But what gives me hope is that I think that when we talk about, structural racism, the young white student in the class doesn't feel guilty when they hear that. They feel angry, when they don't actually like the fact that their friend who might be black gets stopped and searched disproportionately more than them, or their friend who might be black can't get a job because the way that their name means that they're structurally disqualified in terms of being able to get a job. People don't feel kind of bad about that. They feel angry and they want to change society. And I don't think that that fits into the kind of narrow framing of identity politics as it started to operate both within academic discourse and within the wider media discourse specifically. It's not just about individual groups trying to protect and advance their own identity. This is a larger structural question around justice in our society that is bringing in people from all different backgrounds and all different ages.
Kojo, thank you for such an optimistic, and optimism is in short supply. So thank you for such an optimistic answer. Sophie, do you share Kojo's view of Black Lives Matter, reaching beyond the particular concerns of your community?
Yeah, I hate that the Black Lives Matter movement has been made political, because that's just not what it is ever like. I just feel like it's...
What do you mean by...
As in, like, I hate that it's more like instead of, like, it's up for debate sort of thing. So instead of it just being Black Lives Matter, it's like, yeah, but why? And I feel like, especially like on the news or on social media, it's sort of like a thing of, well, what about everyone else, when that's not the case? And like Kojo said, I feel like everyone that I'm friends with that's white doesn't feel uncomfortable about talking about Black Lives Matter, and they don't feel uncomfortable about correcting people who do say things incorrectly or people who are racist, which I'm so happy to know that the people I'm around support me and defend the movement 100%. And also, like, at the protests that happened in Colchester, it wasn't just Black people there, it was a mixture of everyone. There was white people, there was old people, young people, there was literally everyone was there to support, which is really nice and comforting as well.
Thank you. Again, an optimistic viewpoint. Thank you, Sophie. Let's move to the audience. We have a question from my colleague, Tom Flynn. So with respect to the recent Millwall events, Millwall is a football club in South London. That's not too far from where I grew up, funnily enough. A government minister, refusing to condemn the booing, urged the public to distinguish between the concept of Black Lives Mattering and the alleged political movement known as BLM. Though the minister was being disingenuous, this does raise questions. How should a mass movement translate its agenda, concretize itself into the institutional forms that our politics media expect? Or should it not? And should it remain a mass movement outside structures? Sophie, how do you see what you are doing with the local Black Lives Matter chapter? Do you see it as outside of existing structures, outside of existing media, or as having to work within them? You're muted.
I think it's a mixture of both. And I feel like like all the work I did, and as much as I've tried to educate people, there's still going to be people that just don't agree and who will still be racist and will have something to say. And for so long, I thought that it was not my role to sort of educate people, and it's just not. I just haven't got it in me to argue with a racist person. I'm not doing it. If you don't want to understand what I'm telling you, I'm not going to waste my time and to try convince you otherwise. And I feel like the media played such a big role as well. And I got to sort of experience it firsthand. So at the first protest, a picture was taken and the journalist came up to me and he was like, oh, this is what's going out. And he showed me it. And I was like, okay, that's amazing. And then the next day, the editor changed the title to fit the narrative. And I was sort of like, wow. Like I wasn't surprised, but I was just like, okay, fair enough.
There's an analysis of the Occupy movement, that runs along those lines. It kind of says, actually, it failed to really sort of engage with more mainstream. It failed to engage with learn the mainstream tricks, really, that's required. It failed to provide some space within which some dialogue and conversation with the elite, the establishment, the powers that be, effectively. And that's in part why Occupy became just slowly disappeared. Is that something that you think Black Lives Matter can learn from?
Yeah, definitely.
Cool, thank you. Kojo, Tom's question for you, it's a tough question. It does speak to sort of what it is that we're all doing, and the extent to which, if you become mainstream, you necessarily align yourself with kind of norms and values that are systemically racist and therefore systemically unjust. How would you respond?
I think it's a difficult line to really tread. The question of what happens to mass social movements, particularly in this kind of decentralized, quickly communicated social media age. What happens to those movements when they become institutionalized? What happens to the opposition to those movements when you give a target, specific individuals, specific institutions that are seen as the manifestation of Black Lives Matter rather than something that's quite nebulous and that seems to be spreading organically? But at the same time, without institutions, there's no way to actually be able to place the leverage on the instruments of power in order to ensure that Black lives do matter. There's a danger without those institutions that we start to get the essentially the kind of mass marketization of Black Lives Matter, that becoming a branding slogan that, drinks companies and, sportswear companies, place over their products, consumer products, in order to present a certain kind of radical persona, but don't provide the kind of institutional backing that can allow for a transformation in the lives of those most vulnerable individuals and how they face state power, essentially. I think an example of how institutional and kind of organizing work could function positively has been the very recent response to the potential deportation of Jamaican migrants, or Jamaican born. Some of them had obviously been here since they were children, younger than even when I came over to the United Kingdom. So some of them have been here their entire lives and never been to Jamaica, but being foreign-born criminals, as was framed, therefore, first pick for deportation flights out of the United Kingdom. The ability to organize and to be able to place the opposition to that within the public media, to be able to gain access of individual people from all different backgrounds, and to be able to place pressure on the government, meant that at least some of them were able to be taken off that flight, and some of them weren't facing deportation, and some of them with their families, their children were able to have access to their parents, which they wouldn't have done had they been deported to the Caribbean. So I think that was an example of how a certain amount of organization institution is necessary in order to make interventions when that is important. But also, the last thing I'd want to say on that is there were organizations already operating across issues such as, the policing, whether we're talking about the gangs matrix or joint enterprise, around questions such as deaths in custody, around questions such as, migration, all of these issues that Black Lives Matter was pushing back on. There were organizations already pushing back against that. UFFC for deaths in custody, London Campaign Against State and Police Violence for policing issues. And what Black Lives Matter, I think, has done has almost served as a kind of coordinating point for all of these different organizations and smaller campaigns. And it can become a sort of launching pad for them to get their message to a wider audience. And so maybe that's the kind of dual role that an institutionalized Black Lives Matter could play, is using its kind of, hate to talk in these terms, but it's kind of brand appeal to kind of elevate these other organizations, institutions in their work and their advocacy.
Thank you, Kojo. We have another question from the audience. We have two questions from the audience. They're coming in thick and fast. A university's power to address systematic racism is twofold. First, the power of an academic as a leader, and second is the opportunity to foster opportunities and environments where racism can be addressed. To what extent do you believe universities are making use of this in practice and not merely on, on surface level? So we have a perfect opportunity to hear from both a student and faculty perspective on this. So Sophie, how would you respond to that particular question?
I don't think universities are doing much at all or anything. I think maybe like universities as a whole, not as much. Maybe lecturers and professors individually might be trying to, but I feel like the people who actually have a say and actually can make change happen aren't doing as much or are not addressing the issues at hand and are sort of brushing it under the carpet and waiting for it to blow over and sort of be like, okay, we got away with that again. But I feel like we're not going to give up. We're here to make noise and let people know that change needs to happen.
Thank you, Sophie. Kojo, a perspective from a long-standing academic. How would you respond?
I think, again, talking about the role of universities is, it's really quite crucial at this particular time because, as Sophie just mentioned, there is a difference between making kind of concessions towards the public mood when it seems like the movement's in the ascendancy and actually changing the culture and changing the structures of how the institution functions. And, I think that, firstly, in terms of to the question, I think the idea of the power of the academic is one that I think a lot of academics would be like, we have power. It doesn't necessarily feel like that because of the way in which the university is changing in terms of how it operates. And also, I think this is also me responding to having been accused of producing optimism in the previous question, and no self-respecting academic wants to be optimistic. And I think that there is, a real incentive towards narrowing down the ability for individual kind of research pathways essentially to deviate from the overall function of the university and ensure that it's able to sustain itself on a financial basis. And so I think that is something that is going to be really difficult for academics or students to do individually. But I think collectively, if there's a unification between the academics and the students, if there's that they're trying to do the same thing, I think that then there's an opportunity potentially for a bit of significant change. So yeah, that's what I'd probably say to that, is to think about, students will realize they have a lot more power than they might imagine. Maybe academics obviously could do more and together rather than being in opposition with each other. I think there's a real opportunity for what's seen as the standard experience of the university to really change. It shouldn't be that, oh well, to decolonize the curriculum means we're going to add this one module on like race and the law and never think about actually, well, when we're teaching criminal law, where's the conversation around the way in which criminal law disproportionately impacts on particular communities? When we're thinking about trade law, is there a space for conversation about the distinction between the global south and the global north and how trade law facilitates that? How do we feed this into the actual core of our education rather than pretending that it's something that you can ignore and maybe hire one academic of color to kind of teach a race and law module and then just not have to deal with it because you can say to students, well, we've given you that quick concession. I'd be interested also to hear from you about what your thoughts would be about the university and its role in this, Andrew, as well, and how you think that it might be able to respond to this moment on a substantive level.
Yeah, it's profound. I have profoundly, my views on academia obviously are heavily influenced by my own kind of intellectual, ideological prejudices, I suppose, and they are located within a neo-Marxist critical theory framework that sees the university in quite contradictory terms. One, it has this incredible opportunity, because education affords us incredible opportunity to change the world, to change the way in which people think about who we are and how we relate to each other. But at the same time, it's always doing so within a compromised context, and it's very difficult to overcome that context, particularly insofar as access to academia remains a privilege. And the value that academia has to confer seemingly requires it to have that sort of privileged access dimension to it. It's almost like a luxury good, as it were. When everybody can afford it, it's no longer a luxury. It loses its appeal and its charm. I think there's a great deal of work to be done, and I think those of us who have these sorts of, for want of a less provocative word, kind of radical viewpoints on what university is and what it can achieve, we need to work together much more effectively, which is something we're not good at doing. Let's be honest, and certainly not in the human rights field, where the whole idea of a social movement is something many academics are nervous about in various ways. This discussion we could have forever, so I'm going to move on because there are some other questions in the last few minutes remaining to us. Here's one on cultural appropriation. So what are your views on cultural appropriation? To what extent does it act as a barrier against anti-racist strategies and actions permeating institutions and people's lives? Or does it enhance both identity politics on the one hand and political correctness on the other? Who wants to address that particular question? Sophie, are you happy to have a stab at this one?
Yeah, I'm just reading the question. So my views on cultural appropriation, I feel like sometimes there is a fine line between appreciation and appropriation. And honestly, I've learned that sometimes people don't actually know they're appropriating culture. And I feel like we put pressure on people to just know everything. And some people just don't know what they're doing is wrong until they're educated about it. Sorry, just reading the question to what? I'm not too sure. Kojo, would you like to finish the answer off? I'm not too sure.
No, definitely not finishing off. I think similar to yourself, it's something that I guess I'd usually be quite ambivalent about. But I think this are the two things I would say, and this might be the contribution of a boring, legal scholar who does a lot of work with kind of property law, is that often I hear so much conversation around the cultural appropriation part, and again, it's about the culture, but not much about the appropriation part, and that's what people are angry about. Like, there's this idea that, like, oh, if you decide to wear your hair this way or you wear the wrong colors, then all of a sudden all these people are kind of going to go insane at you. Maybe on social media that might happen because of the particular dynamics of social media. But in terms of what the critique of cultural appropriation orientated about, it was about the taking of not just another person's culture, but then establishing a property claim around it that allowed you to exercise ownership over it. Let's take the kind of most famous example people talk about with kind of like music is, the kind of emergence of, say, rock and roll and out of a tradition of rhythm and blues prior to that it wasn't just you're not allowed to play rhythm and blues. It's like, play it if you want, but when you have an industry that establishes itself as a rock and roll industry, putting forward white artists owned by white record company labels, all profiting from a culture that it's saying that it now invented in terms of the popular discourse. Now there's been an appropriation, and that's led to the economic disenfranchisement of the original community that actually came up with that culture. I think that's what people are really angry about, when they talk about cultural appropriation. And, I think that it's now become this catch-all, like, moral panic. And even with the kind of Adele thing that happened, and I think there was a lot of people who were like, this isn't cultural appropriation, we don't care. Like, if it's Mount Hill Carnival, you want to wear your hair, you want to wear a Jamaican flag, that's fine, you know what I mean? But if Adele produced a dance hall album the next year and said, I've come out with this new sound and there's no Jamaican artists on it and there's no Jamaican producers on it, now we're in the realm of cultural appropriation. So for me, I think about it maybe in those kind of boring legalistic terms a bit more.
well, they're not just boringly legalistic, Kojo. They're also they're very critical, right? In respect of you're focusing upon commodities and capitalism that we're all subject to and exposed to in all sorts of ways. That one of the accusations, and I'm sure you're very familiar with this literature, is precisely that capitalism just empties out the meaning, the substance and the meaning of any particular phenomenon, turns everything into an exchangeable good. Ultimately, everything and everyone becomes something to be bought and sold. So it's interesting for you to sort of to focus upon the wrongness of it being that cultures are being kind of expropriated, and then other people are benefiting from them in various ways. It's an interesting angle to take. But thank you. I'm going to move on to what will be our final question, given that we're almost out of time, and it's from Mavis, one of our students, it would seem. So since my course at the university, LLM, I have not been taught by someone who looks like me. Does this mean that my dream of teaching in that field will not become a reality, or no Black woman before me had such a dream? Kojo, did you want to, and I was going to ask you in response to your response to one of the earlier questions about whether you take yourself to be a role model in some sense, and whether you're entirely, if you're comfortable with that, or if it raises certain questions for you. Did you want to have a first go at this particular question from Mavis?
Oh, please don't take me to be a role model. Far too many skeletons in my closet to take up that position. But I would, I wouldn't lie to Mavis and talk about the obstacles and hurdles of being able to enter the academy, the legal academy specifically. Being a Black person, empathize again for being a Black woman. The statistics are stark when we talk about the absence of Black academics. And I don't think representation is everything, but, I think on the last counting, it was 9 Black female professors in the entirety of England and Wales. This is horrific when you think about it. So there are definite obstacles, but there is also real traditions of, especially thinking about legal scholarship from the position of Black female insight. There are incredible traditions, more in the United States, but now emerging in the United Kingdom as well, of that insight. Some of the most kind of the most, I would say, influential contributions of academia over the last 25 years have come from a tradition of Black female feminist scholarship. Kimberly Crenshaw's insights around intersectionality is now something that, if you spoke at a Fortune 500 company or you spoke at a school, people would know what that means. What are we talking about intersectionality? This is built into, hiring processes and all kinds of things. The idea around critical race theory, for all its controversy, again, really pushed forward by Black female scholarship. Patricia Williams, Cheryl Harris. When I was talking about, whiteness as property and the question of appropriation, that's Cheryl Harris's insights that I'm drawing upon there. So Black female legal scholars have been able to not only enter the academy, but really excel in the academy as well. And, if that's something that you're interested in doing, I would familiarize yourself with their work and find confidence in the idea that you could follow in their pathways, as well as feel free to be able to draw upon contributions and academic insights from all different types of scholars. I think that's the other thing that we want to avoid as well. I don't want to just be, like, my PhD does of course draw on, kind of Black scholars like Frantz Fanon and Amy Césaire, but it's also hugely indebted to, French post-structural thinkers like René Girard and Michel Foucault. And, I think that part of an academic is to feel the freedom to be able to draw upon all of those. And, I'd really, hope that if that is something that you're interested in, you felt, able to do that and to reach out to other people who can be, yeah, I wouldn't describe myself as a mentor in any way or a role model, but I would like to be like a friend and an assistant to people who wanted to enter into this profession and give people some of the do's and don'ts that I found in my experience. So please feel free to email me, and that's to anybody who's also listening, who's interested in that as well. I'd be happy to speak to you further.
Kojo, that's great. Thank you so much. Sophie, how would you respond to Mavis's concern?
I think that's even more reason to pursue your dreams and to break into spaces where you don't feel comfortable. I don't think that's a reason you should feel discouraged. I feel like even more than anything, you should want to yeah.
Another optimistic response, but whilst acknowledging that the horrendous inequalities that exist, and these are becoming ever more apparent as the numbers of BAME students of color, people of color, attend universities, right? And the disparity between faculty and students becomes so much more marked and so much more obvious. But thank you so much to both of you. Thank you for this really interesting discussion. Thank you to the audience for your questions. I hope you found it both inspiring and optimistic. I know Kojo well. I'm not sure Kojo would always be comfortable with being labeled as an optimist, but if not now, when, right? We need to seize the moment. It's been a real pleasure chairing this discussion. This is our first event in a series of events we're holding this week as part of Human Rights Week. Our next event coming up will be a lecture on ecocide and human rights from my former professor at Essex and my former PhD supervisor, Professor Jay Bernstein. So he'll be speaking on ecocide and human rights on Wednesday evening. It just remains for me to thank Kojo, to thank Sophie formally on behalf of the Human Rights Centre. Thank you so much. Look forward to us working together and establishing these kinds of networks and collaborations that we were referring to drive these particular interests and these norms forward. Thank you, everyone. Have a good evening and stay warm and stay safe. Thank you. Take care.
Thank you very much.
Goodbye.